Hi, my name is Teresa, and although I'm now a grown woman with experience and my own perspective, this story takes me back to my 24th year when life was just beginning to feel more or less stable and predictable, but also held many worries and surprises. Back then, I was still living with my parents, even though I'd graduated from college 2 years earlier and found a stable job at an insurance company. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was decent enough and gave me a sense of security about the future. People sometimes asked why I hadn't moved out yet since I could afford my own place, but I never felt the need. My mom and dad were nearby. Our home was always warm and respectful, and besides, saving money seemed like a smart move, considering I had a long life ahead of me and anything could happen. My younger sister, Christina, was still a student at the time, just 20 years old. She was in her second year of college in a neighboring town, where she went to study, returning home only for breaks and holidays. Her life was simpler. Her parents covered her expenses completely, from tuition and rent to food and pocket money. She truly had everything handed to her on a silver platter. As for me, looking back on my student years, I realized that our circumstances were different. When I was studying, I had to work part-time at the university bookstore until late at night, and on weekends I also picked up shifts at the diner to cover food and rent. Even though my scholarship covered most of my tuition, my parents still couldn't completely free me from my worries. I vividly remember the feeling of exhaustion when, after a 9-hour shift at the store, you return to your small room and count your change to make sure you have enough for breakfast tomorrow, and then, clutching a textbook, fight sleep and force yourself to finish reading at least a couple of pages. It wasn't easy, but those years taught me to truly appreciate every penny and understand that money doesn't fall from the sky. Mom and Dad, for all their hard work, were never living in luxury. Dad worked as an executive in a construction company, and Mom worked as a secretary in a law firm. It was enough to support our home and even maintain the small country house by the river that had been passed down in our family for generations, but nothing more. That year, everything took a different turn. Dad fell ill and couldn't work for several weeks, and Mom lost part of her time due to layoffs, and for the first time in many years, I saw worry on their faces when they thought no one was noticing. Conversations about money became more frequent, and one evening I overheard my mother whispering to my father, as if afraid of her own words, that in 3 months it would be time to pay for Christina's education, and they simply had no savings left, as they had before. My father silently rubbed his forehead. He always did this when trying to find a way out of a difficult situation. And then my mother gently suggested they consider a country house full of old things that no one had needed for a long time. And from that moment on, everything spiraled. Every Saturday and Sunday, my parents would go to the little house by the river, clear out dusty boxes, drag out into the light of day the boat, long since forgotten, the cabinets and dressers that had once held Grandma's dresses and Grandpa's papers, and sort through tools, furniture, and all sorts of odds and ends that had accumulated in the shed and attic for decades. I saw how tired they were, but also how they perked up when they managed to sell something to the neighbors or put it online. The boat went to Mr. Peterson for $3,000. The old dining room set went to another family for $800. My father's tool collection brought in another $1,200, and some things even went to the scrapyard. So, little by little, by the end of 2 months, they had collected $15,000 in cash and put it all in a large envelope, neatly arranging the 20s, 50s, and 100s. Christina knew nothing. She was living her student life in college while a tense anticipation reigned in our house. And then, last Tuesday morning, my father called me into the kitchen before I left for work. I walked in, saw him sitting at the table with that same thick envelope in his hands, and I immediately sensed that he was excited about something. "Teresa, do me a favor," he said, placing the envelope on the table so it was right between us. "This is all the money from the sale of the things in the country house, $15,000. You need to deposit it into our family bank account today." I took the envelope and felt its weight, as if it contained not just the crunch of paper, but our entire family's hope for the future. "Dad, this is too much to carry. Are you sure you want me to take it straight to work?" I asked, feeling anxiety welling up inside me. I'd go myself, but I'm booked up all day with meetings, and Mom has an important presentation for a client. You're the only one who can get to the bank, he replied, and I glanced at my watch and realized I only had 10 minutes before I had to leave. But then the realization hit me. The bank opens later than I usually do at work, and I physically wouldn't be able to get there today. Dad, I can't make it today. I have a project deadline. My boss sternly said I need to go all day, but tomorrow is my day off and I'll drop off the money first thing in the morning, I said, trying to sound confident. He nodded, sighing heavily. Okay, then just hide them somewhere for the night. When I got to my room, I glanced around the room in confusion, as if every object could tell me where to hide the envelope. The first thing that came to mind was the dresser, but the thought that it was the most obvious place quickly made me abandon the idea. So I went to the desk and, opening the top drawer, saw a stack of old notes and student papers that no one had needed in a long time. It was there, under a thick layer of paper, that I carefully tucked the money, hoping it would be safe until morning. When I returned from work that evening, tired but pleased that I had managed to complete part of the project, I had barely crossed the threshold when I froze. Christina was pacing the living room, easily and freely, as if it were her own apartment. And from her gait alone, I sensed that something was wrong. She was wearing expensive jeans that fit her skinny legs perfectly, a soft sweater with a bright designer logo, and new shoes, shiny and crisp, so fresh I could only guess at the price, because they probably cost more than I earned in a week. She was holding a new phone, the exact model everyone had been talking about for months, and I knew its price, over $1,000, and the thought of how she could afford all this instantly pricked my heart. Christina, I said, setting my work bag down by the door, when did you get here? And what's all this? Where did you get the money for such things? Did you get a job? I tried to speak calmly, but my voice was filled with disbelief. Christina laughed, and there wasn't a drop of warmth in her laughter. It was harsh, caustic, and unpleasant. A job? Are you serious? Do you think I'm crazy enough to toil away at some crappy part-time job like you did in college? Her words cut me like a knife. I felt a wave of foreboding run through me. Then how did you pay for all this? I asked, clenching my hands so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Oh, don't worry, I just borrowed some from a secret place, she said with a smirk, waving the phone as if it were some kind of trophy. Something inside me snapped. I suddenly had a clear sense of where that money could have come from, and a cold realization pierced me to the bone. Without another word, I rushed to my room, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed everyone in the house could hear it, and yanked open the desk drawer. Papers, notebooks, old notes, everything was there, except for the envelope itself. I frantically shuffled through each sheet, hoping the bills had somehow miraculously stuck or gotten stuck, but the drawer was empty. The envelope was gone. I stood there, staring into that empty drawer, and it felt like time had stood still, like the seconds dragged on forever, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. Realizing there was no hope, I returned to the living room with a ragged breath. Christina was standing in front of the mirror, her head cocked coquettishly, taking a selfie, smiling as if the whole world belonged to her. "Christina!" I shouted, my voice so sharp that my sister flinched and looked up. "What's wrong?" she asked, a flicker of alarm in her gaze, though she quickly hid it behind a mask of indifference. I opened my mouth to tell her everything, but at that moment her phone rang and she answered immediately, putting the receiver to her ear. "Yes, baby, did you get it?" "I sent you 10,000 today as I promised." Her voice was sweet and melodious. I'd never heard her use that tone before. "Yes, I know, you need money to pay off your debts. Don't worry about paying it back now, just do what you need to do." I couldn't believe my ears. $10,000 from that very envelope. I jumped up to her, snatched the phone from her hand, and ended the call. "Why did you take money from my room?" I screamed, my voice breaking. Christina rolled her eyes as if I'd asked a stupid question. "Oh, please, Teresa, don't start." I came to your place to get your charger because mine broke, and I saw the envelope. It was just sitting there in the drawer. It's family money, and I'm family, so I figured I could put it to good use instead of letting it gather dust under your papers." I was so stunned by her audacity that I was speechless. But then, as if wanting to drive me crazy, she picked up her new phone and snapped a photo right in my face. "You should see yourself now. You look absolutely insane," she said, laughing, relishing the moment. I felt my blood boil, but before I could answer, the front door slammed, and Mom and Dad walked into the living room, tired from work. "What's going on here?" Dad asked, eyeing us warily, instantly sensing the tension. "Christina took the money from my room and spent it all," I shouted, my voice higher than I'd intended, as if I couldn't believe I had to say it. Mom paled, her eyes widened, and she shook her head, as if in disbelief. "What?" "Teresa, that's not funny. Don't joke like that." "I'm not joking, Mom," I said, and the words burst out of my chest, because seeing the mountains of bags in the living room and her wearing luxurious clothes she'd never worn before meant one thing to me. Our money was gone. The very savings my parents had sold things for and sorted through boxes in the attic on weekends, and I just heard her on the phone talking about sending someone $10,000. The words stuck in the air, and they were so full of hurt and horror that no one in the room could ignore them. Christina turned pale before our eyes, but she tried to play it off. Her tone, her posture, her smile, which was completely at odds with what was happening, all betrayed the falseness. "Whose money was that?" she asked, but her voice no longer held the brazen confidence it had a moment ago, and I saw Dad's face flush as if old worries and new fears had simultaneously flared up within him. "We sold everything in the country house to get this money," Mom said quietly, her voice trembling so much that the words barely reached the end. "It was for your education, Christina. It was $15,000 for the semester, for the fees, so you could continue studying next year." I felt my heart clench. All those evenings when they lugged things to the road, when we looked at each other and silently packed boxes, all of this had been deciding someone's fate. And now that fate hung by a thread of someone's irresponsibility. At that moment, Christina completely lost her composure. She screamed and, pointing at me, accused me of something that hadn't happened. "I didn't take anything. Teresa spent the money herself, and now she's trying to blame it on me." Her voice was hysterical, but her conscience was already sobbing in it because the accusation shook like a monument whose supports had been surreptitiously shaken. I didn't remain silent. "How much do you think she could have spent on just the clothes she's wearing now?" I asked, gesturing to the bags strewn on the sofa with tags and receipts, as if the evidence of her extravagance demanded to be noticed. Dad came over and began pulling out items one by one: jeans with labels, tops that would soon end up in the closet, a leather jacket that clearly cost more than a week's salary, and every item in this list sounded like an accusation. Christina screamed at first, then burst into tears, and finally blurted out a confession that lulled the icy silence in the house. Okay, I took it. But I thought it was Teresa's money. I thought it was her savings from work. She begged for forgiveness through her sobs, and I looked at her with complete disbelief because trust isn't restored in a breath and because her excuses were paper thin. I told her bluntly, "So you thought my money would just fall into your lap? You thought you could take $15,000 and not answer?" And my words weren't full of malice for the sake of malice. They contained a demand for justice I'd been waiting for a long time. Even Mom and Dad were stunned by her confession. Dad's voice grew quiet and heavy as he said, "Quiet, Christina. That was money for your education. We don't have that kind of savings anymore, and we worked for it for years." And every word carried the weariness of someone who saw their labor disintegrate due to the fleeting weakness of someone else's choice. Christina sobbed louder and promised to return the things to the stores, as many still had the tags. But Dad, not giving in to tears, asked about the $10,000 that, according to me, she transferred to someone over the phone. Through her sobs, she named a name: Durrent, her boyfriend, who had gambling debts and a threat, and who had promised to pay them back someday. The word someday rang out in the house like a death sentence. Mom sank onto the sofa, covering her face with her hands, and quietly said what was forming on her tired lips. "I've always defended you, Christina, found excuses and explanations, but today you've crossed all boundaries." And these words, steady and firm, signified not only a reproach, but also a decision they'd been pondering for the past few weeks while counting coins and recounting receipts. Christina ran into her room, slammed the door, and dinner passed in silence, as if a chill had taken its place, gradually creeping over us all. Later, she returned with puffy eyes, sitting at the table but without saying a word, and we all understood that change was coming, no matter how much we wanted to postpone it. Finally, Dad put down his fork, looked at his daughter, and said firmly, without a shadow of a doubt, "Your mother and I have made a decision. We won't demand an immediate refund, but starting next semester, you'll take a year off from school, go to work, and earn your own money for your studies. No gifts, no perks, no more expenses we've paid for until you prove you're responsible." Christina burst into tears again, begging for mercy. But a new reality hung in the house, and a strange relief filled my heart, because having seen her protected before, I knew that only real consequences can change people, and now she was about to face real consequences for her actions. That night, around midnight, when the entire house had already fallen into a thick silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the wood in the wind outside, I heard a cautious, almost timid knock on my bedroom door. Raising myself up on my elbow, I realized it was Christina, because no one else would have scratched so hesitantly on the wood, as if afraid of being rejected before she could even speak. She looked desperate, her eyes glittering in the dim light, and her voice was barely audible. "Teresa, please, I need to ask you something." As she spoke, she glanced nervously toward her parents' bedroom, as if afraid of being caught in another misdemeanor. "What do you need?" I asked dryly, though deep down I already knew the conversation would lead to nothing good. "Could you lend me $15,000? I swear I'll pay it back as soon as I graduate and find a real job. You know how important college is to me." I stared at her in amazement because demanding money after what had happened that afternoon seemed not even impudent, but some strange distortion of reality. "Are you serious?" I said, my voice shaking with anger. "After you stole from your parents and ruined their plans, you have the nerve to ask me for help." But Christina, as if she hadn't heard or pretended not to, stepped closer. "Come on, Teresa. We're sisters. Family helps family, right?" I shook my head, and the coldness in my answer was harder than iron. "No, Christina. Absolutely not. You made your choice today." She stood by the door for a moment longer, her lips trembling, her eyes ablaze with a mixture of hurt and fear. But a second later, she turned and ran into her room, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I lay in bed and couldn't fall asleep for a long time, my thoughts returning to the past, to every time Christina did the same. As a child, she would take my toys without asking, and I would search the house for them until she, feigning innocence, returned them broken. In high school, she would steal my clothes, returning them ruined with stains or torn seams, and sometimes not at all. She even took the money from my piggy bank, which I had saved for so long for something special, without a twinge of conscience. And every time I complained to my parents, they repeated the same thing. "She's your little sister, Teresa. She doesn't mean you any harm. You need to learn to share." She probably needed it for something important. And now, lying in the darkness, I suddenly wondered, would they have been so calm if Christina had stolen my savings instead of their own? Or would they have found excuses again? The next morning, as we sat at breakfast, Christina chose a new tactic. She came downstairs with a look of feigned remorse and, in a quiet voice, as if rehearsed, said, "I'm so sorry about yesterday. I know I did the wrong thing, and I promise I'll never do it again." Dad didn't even look up from his cup of coffee. His voice was cold and unyielding. "Apologizing won't change our decision. You won't get a penny from us anymore for tuition or rent." Christina desperately retorted, "But I can't possibly earn enough to pay for everything myself," and again tried to evoke pity, but her father cut her off as if with a knife. "You should have thought about that before spending our money." This conversation is over. Later that morning, Christina made a scene, ostentatiously packing her things, throwing clothes into suitcases with a bang, stamping her feet so that everyone in the house could hear her indignation. She dragged the suitcases to the door and, theatrically wiping away tears, said, "Fine. If you don't want me here, I'll go somewhere where people will actually care about me." With these words, she slammed the door and left, leaving a heavy silence and anxiety in the house. We didn't hear from her all day, and only the next day, when the phone rang, did we hear from her again. It was Grandma, her voice agitated and upset. "Teresa, what happened?" Christina called me in tears and said you kicked her out of the house and weren't letting her finish college. She said you were the reason she had problems with her parents. I handed the phone to my dad, and he calmly, step by step, told Grandma the whole truth. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then Grandma finally said, "Oh my God, I had no idea. She made it look like you were being unfair to her. She asked me for money for college, too." "And what did you tell her?" Dad asked. "At first I promised to think about it, but after what you said, I won't give her a penny. In fact, I'm going to check my house right now to make sure she didn't take anything when she visited me last month." In the following days, the phone never stopped ringing. Aunt Sarah calling, asking why Christina was asking her for money. Uncle Mike told me that Christina came to him with some story about helping pay for college. Cousin Jennifer lamented that Christina had asked her to co-sign on her student loans. Each time, my parents had to explain the real situation, and each time, my relatives were stunned and refused to help. A week later, Christina returned home. She looked exhausted, defeated, her eyes dull, and sinking into a chair in the living room, she quietly confessed, "I've been to everyone. Relatives, friends from college, even friends of friends. No one helped me." Mom looked at her seriously and asked, "And that surprises you?" Christina sighed heavily and said, "Look, I'll do what Dad wants. I'll take a year off and work. But can I at least stay here so I don't have to pay rent? If I have to rent an apartment, I'll never be able to save for college." Mom and Dad exchanged glances, and in that look, full of hidden meaning and the unspoken words accumulated over many years of family life, I once again caught that quiet, almost telepathic conversation that spouses conduct silently, with just their eyes. "You can stay," Dad finally said, his voice heavy and inflexible, "but you will follow our rules and will not ask us for money for anything." Only 2 months had passed since all this drama, and I felt it was time to finally take the step I'd been thinking about for a long time, moving out of my parents' house. I found a cozy one-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes away, and over the course of one intense weekend, I moved all my belongings there, every box, every bag, as if ripping away pieces of my past. It was incredibly nice to feel free for the first time in a long time. My own personal space, where no one slammed doors, threw tantrums, or barged into my room without asking. Especially after everything that had happened, it felt like a breath of fresh air. A few weeks later, my mother called me and shared news about Christina. There was weariness in her voice, but also a hint of hope. She got a job as a waitress at a family restaurant downtown. She works really hard, Teresa. She gives us her entire salary every week and only keeps tips for incidentals. I was genuinely surprised to learn that Christina was actually working, and although my heart remained wary, I felt a strange joy. Maybe she was finally starting to learn responsibility. 2 months later, on a Sunday afternoon, I returned to my parents' house. I was curious to see with my own eyes how Christina was getting on with her new job. When I crossed the threshold and entered the kitchen, I barely recognized her. The girl who had recently sported designer outfits, perfect makeup, and an expensive manicure was now sitting at the table in simple jeans and a plain t-shirt. Her face was bare, her hair was pulled back haphazardly, her hands were rough, and yet there was something new in this simplicity. The real Christina, tired yet sincere, the way I hadn't seen her in years. "Hello, Christina. I said, sitting down across from her. She looked up, a brief twinkle in her tired eyes, and I asked, "How are things at work?" She sighed, rubbed her forehead with her palm, and replied, "It's hard work. My legs hurt all the time, and some of the customers are incredibly rude, but I'm doing better than I was when I started." At that moment, Mom walked into the kitchen and hugged me, her hands warm, filled with a kind of quiet gratitude. "Teresa, just in time," she said. "I was going to tell Christina about the new account." "What account?" I asked, surprised, and Dad followed, holding a mug of coffee. "We opened a special savings account for her. Every week when she brings us her paycheck, we put the entire amount in there. She only keeps the tips." "The tips aren't big," Christina added quietly. $40, maybe $50 a week. I even had to sell my new phone and buy an old flip phone just to get by." I noticed that she was holding an ancient model with a scuffed case, like the kind she'd used 10 years ago. It looked especially stark compared to the expensive smartphone she'd once bought with her parents' money. "We told Christina she can't touch this money for a year," my mother explained, looking at me seriously. "In 12 months, we'll give her access to the account, and then she'll decide for herself." "What do you mean, decide for herself?" I asked. My father's expression turned stern. He set the mug on the table and said, "She can use the money to go back to college. Or she can give it to her boyfriend. But if she chooses him, she'll leave this house forever." I looked at Christina, expecting a violent reaction, but she only nodded as if she'd understood the choice had been brewing for a long time. "Speaking of Durant," Mom lowered her voice, even though we were the only ones in the kitchen. "I heard Christina talking to him last week. He asked her for money again." "And what did you tell him?" I asked my sister. She looked away and said barely audibly, "I told him I didn't have any money. He got angry and called me selfish. He always says that if I truly loved him, I would find a way to help him with his debts." I looked at her carefully. "What do you think about it?" A long pause hung in the air. Then Christina finally said, "I think Durant only loves me when I can give him something." 4 months later, Mom called me again and, unable to contain her emotions, blurted out the news. Christina broke up with Durant. It turned out he'd continued to pressure her for money even after she'd explained she had no access to her savings. When she refused to ask us for money, he'd become rude, and then she'd finally put an end to it. "Good job," I said sincerely, without a hint of irony. "Did he at least return the $10,000? Mom laughed, but her laugh was bitter. Of course not. Christina finally realized he'd never intended to return it. He'd told her that money should be shared freely between husband and wife, and her requests for repayment were a sign of mistrust. I felt anger rise within me again just thinking about that money, how easily it had been spent, and how hard it had been for my parents to earn. But alongside that irritation, I felt genuine pride for Christina, who had finally seen Durant for who he was and stopped making excuses for his actions. When Christina turned 21 in December, I went to the bank and withdrew $500 in cash, put it in a card, and handed it to her at a celebratory dinner with my parents. Christina opened the envelope, stared at the bills for a long time without saying a word, and only then quietly whispered, "Thank you. You..." And I saw tears glisten in her eyes. But then she did something I never expected. Instead of hiding the money for herself, she handed it to my dad and asked if he could put it in her savings account. "I want to save every penny I can," she said. Dad looked as surprised as I did, but he nodded and took the money. When Christina left the room, the three of us were left alone and, for the first time in years, had a truly honest conversation. "You know, we messed things up with Christina," Mom admitted, her voice full of remorse. "We spoiled her terribly, always making excuses for her behavior and never making her face the consequences." Dad sighed and, looking down, added, "Remember how she took money from your piggy bank, Teresa? We told you to shut up because she was still little, but really, we taught her then that she could take whatever she wanted." I looked at them and said, "I'm glad you finally realized that. but I'm even glad that you're fixing everything now, even if it took something so serious to shake us all up. Meanwhile, my parents were really trying to make a difference. They were working on restoring the country house they'd once sold. Every weekend they went there, painting, repairing, and refurnishing, as if investing not only their energy, but also a measure of their guilt. In the summer, in July, they invited Christina and me to spend a week there together. It was the first time in many years that we were back at the country house as a family. It looked completely different, clean, bright, with new furniture purchased to replace what they'd had to sell. On the third evening, Christina and I sat on the veranda, looking out over the river, the sunset painting the water in warm hues. Everything was peaceful. "You know, I never understood money before," Christina suddenly said, her voice thoughtful. "But now I understand how hard it is to earn even $50. When I see something for $100, I think that's 2 days' work." I nodded. "That's a good way to look at it." She continued, "I always think about that $15,000 and how many hours Mom and Dad worked to earn it. And I just gave it away like it was nothing." Her voice trembled. "It must have been months and months of work for them." I confirmed, "They really did work overtime and weekends to save that money. I wish I could take it all back," she whispered. "The money, the way I treated you, everything." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You can't take back the past, but you can make sure you never do it again." "I won't," she replied firmly. "I swear I won't." I looked at her in the setting sun and believed her, because she looked different, not just because of her simple clothes and lack of makeup, but because her eyes had changed, understanding that actions have consequences. "Christina," I said, "I'm proud of how hard you work." She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen her with in months. "Thank you, Teresa. That really means a lot to me." We sat next to each other, listening to the river flow gently, and I realized that perhaps all that terrible we'd been through was exactly the ordeal meant to be. It forced each of us to face the truth and decide to change. And maybe, just maybe, we'll all be better for having been through it.